period of time. We're going to be writing about this period in our history for the next 100 years. And we're going to be writing about the impact on church and society, and particularly on ministry, because we're doing a lot of well-being work in our diocese at the moment. And one of the things we're really aware of is the kind of identity crisis that an awful lot of clergy have gone through, being cut off from other people, being cut off from peer support, certainly in terms of face-to-face meetings, and operating in situations where their churches are closed and everything's had to go online. Now, I know we're moving back into services going back into church, but it's still a mixed economy. And I certainly know an awful lot of curates that are finding it rather strange and finding it rather hard to fulfill their learning outcomes as well at the moment. So ministry in COVID land is different. It's different. And I think an awful lot of PhD theses in the future years are going to be written around ministerial identity in 2021, because it's changed the way an awful lot of clergy have thought about themselves. It's changed their relationship to their community. And we're also very highly aware that it's emphasized or highlighted some of the feelings of insecurity and a lack of support and a feeling of isolation that we know from lots of research was already there well before the pandemic hit the shores of this country. Uncertainty reveals itself in lots of different ways, and we all have doubts. We all have doubts about our own performance or our own effectiveness or how we're getting on with people or how we're seen by other people. The critical issue is where these doubts become limiting factors. So where these doubts, these forms of self-talk, actually become thoughts that are big enough and powerful enough to change the way we behave, to change the choices that we make. That's really what I'm talking about this evening. I'm not talking about passing moments of insecurity when you're having perhaps a bad day or not feeling so great about what you've done. These are repeated thoughts, repeated states of mind that actually change the way you behave, they change the way you interact with other people, and they change the decisions that you make. Confidence is a strange thing, isn't it? Because we know an awful lot of people who have a surface confidence. You know that through the pastoral work that you do. You know, the kind of people who brightly say, yes, I'm fine. I noticed that in myself. If anybody ever asks me how I am, that's always the answer. Very chipper, very upbeat, absolutely fine. It may not be true, but it does reveal a kind of attempt at a surface confidence. And that surface confidence can, of course, be paper thin, can't it? And there can be overconfidence too. Sometimes in discussion groups like this, people like to point out the fact that some people are overconfident. They just have perhaps too great a sense of their own abilities. To me, that's rarer than the significant number of people that hold themselves back by not having quite enough confidence to do something which is just slightly brave, slightly outside their comfort zone. And an idea I'd plant in your minds at this stage already is this idea of good enough. Because one of the great pressures, I think, on ministers generally, but certainly Church of England clergy, is having to be excellent in a number of different categories simultaneously. Excellent preachers, excellent pastors, excellent administrators, excellent church builders and missionaries. We're looking for excellence across the range. Well, how about the idea of good enough? Good enough is a very powerful idea because it allows you to understand where you can rest, where you can stop, where you can do what's within your powers rather than beating yourself up for all the things that you haven't done. It also rests on a theology of Sabbath, which we would all share as a principle, and a theology of abundance as well, celebrating what we've done rather than being miserable about what we failed to achieve. That's a thought in passing. So this is something, I think, of the identity crisis that some clergy are experiencing. And if you aren't, well, that's great. But there will be people around you who are. There'll be colleagues, there'll be parishioners, certainly, who are also experiencing their own changed interaction with the world and society. A lot of people are a lot more frightened than they were. a lot less confident about social interaction, less confident about making positive choices for themselves. Lack of contact enforced through COVID, but before that, there was lack of contact perhaps enforced through over busy diaries, lack of time as well. And the whole concept, I think, of ministerial identity has been under threat. How far it restores, we don't know, because one thing we are fairly clear about, I think, is church is going to be different in future. For some people, it may not only be mildly different. I think for some communities, some locations, some institutions, it will be dramatically different. And as resources get thinner and clergy get more and more stretched, we are going to have to keep looking at clergy resilience and confidence as an unfolding issue and a really important thing that's part of well-being. We've been quite good at looking at stipendiary clergy, and that there's been some good research on that, some books written about stress in clergy, but most of the focus has been on stipendiary clergy so far. So it's time that we learned about other kinds of ministers who are also affected. So self-talk, what do we mean by that? Well, I think the picture says it all, really. It's the things that we say that influence the way we see the world, the voices in your head. Now, some people literally hear them as voices in your head. When I say that, I don't really mean magical voices, but I do actually mean phrases that we allow ourselves to repeat, to latch onto. Some obvious examples. I've never been very good at this. People don't trust me. It's all going wrong. Or that mantra, it always happens this way. So what do these things have in common? Well, they have in common a kind of a way of framing the world that says things are not working. This is not the way I hoped things were going to be. It's also about latching on to certain kinds of negative information, latching on to certain forms of experience, certain kinds of feedback, or even just jumping to the wrong conclusion. And sometimes it's even about catastrophizing. And that's certainly true of the phrase, it's all going wrong, where it's probably true to say that some bits going wrong and a lot of it is going right. So what I'd like to do as a way of kickstarting our conversation tonight is allow you to share with each other. David and I are not going to be part of these conversations. We're going to put you in pairs now. And I'd really just like you to see how that lands with you. How does this get in the way for you? Self-talk, how does this get in the way for you? It'd be great if you could be honest with each other, supportive, give each other a chance to say how you're experiencing this and what kind of self-talk you hear. And we're going to give you 10 minutes. So you have a healthy 5 minutes each. So I'll leave it up to the two of you to make sure that there's a balance there. But just think about what kind of self-talk you experience, particularly at 2 o'clock in the morning. 2 o'clock in the morning is a key time because your brain is doing something slightly different. I'll say a bit more about that after the breakout. So David, over to you. If you put us now into, I'll stop sharing. If you put us into pairs in breakout groups, that would be great.
There's one group of 3 people.
That's fine.
So I'm going to open the rooms now, so off you go.
So who would like to, we're mainly focused on this evening, which is imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is, of course, that classic thing where people say, well, I feel like a fake. I feel I'm going to be found out. I feel I've got here by luck, or I've got here because I've kind of convinced other people that I think I know what I'm doing, and I really don't. And the first time I ever heard it, that's how it came out. Somebody saying to me, you know, if somebody came along and stood next to me in my desk in my office and said, "We've found you out. We know you can't do it. Please leave now." He said, "I'd probably just go." That would be it. I wouldn't argue. That was it. I'd pack my desk away and I'd go. And the first time I heard that, I found that really interesting. And then I heard the same sort of story again and again and again. And interestingly, the more senior the people I was working with, the people that I was coaching, the more often I heard that. And one of the reasons for that is that when you become more and more senior in the organization, you often have less peers, less people working alongside you who can give you collegiate support. And also you get less objective feedback from other people about how you're actually doing. Now, we've known about imposter syndrome since the 1970s. It's a very powerful thing. It's about attributing success to luck when there is huge evidence available to you that the things that you have done have worked because you have natural, God-given talents and abilities and knowledge and skills. So the other really interesting thing about imposter syndrome is it isn't just a state of mind. All the research points to the fact that this mode of discounting success, this self-image that says, I'm not really doing any of this myself. I'm just lucky, or I'm just actually skating along here and I will be found out. Or this mindset actually stops people making positive choices. So we know that it persuades people not to book themselves on learning and development courses, or to apply for interesting roles or promotions, and it often prevents people from even accepting positive feedback and compliments. Now, that last one is really important, because the counterbalance to negative thinking is positive information. That's not the same as you beating yourself up and somebody saying, "No, you're really wonderful." That's what you need at 2:00 in the morning. What imposter syndrome can't fight against is objective facts. So it's great to have people around who can actually remind you of what you have done, not just make empty noises about the fact that you're better than you think you are. And to put this in a biblical context, I found a little reading for you, and I'd love it if one of you could read it. Who would like to have a go at this?
I can have a go if you want.
Yes, please. Thank you.
You want to read right from the top to the bottom?
Right from the top.
Yeah. He calls the unqualified. Noah was a drunk. Abraham was too old. Jacob was a liar. Leah was ugly. Joseph was abused. Moses was a stuttering criminal. Samson was promiscuous. Gideon was doubtful. Rahab was a prostitute. Jeremiah was depressed. David had an affair and committed murder. Elijah was mentally unbalanced and suicidal. Isaiah preached naked. When God called Jonah, Jonah ran away. Naomi was an old widow. Job went bankrupt. Peter betrayed Jesus. The disciples fell asleep. Martha was a worrier. The Samaritan woman was a multiple divorcee. Zacchaeus was greedy. Paul was ingrained in another religion. Timothy was too young and had ulcers, and Lazarus was dead. We are in good company.
Thank you very much, Giselle. Yes, and Lazarus was dead. So it's a lovely reworking of the whole of the Bible narrative, isn't it? A history of glorious failure. And we know that, don't we? Because we preach it. We preach the fact that God chooses the most unpromising people and turns what they have, turns their apparently unpromising character set and skill set towards his glorious purposes. So we know it because it's what we say every Sunday, but we don't believe it for ourselves. And there is, of course, a huge amount within our theology that talks about really understanding what we mean by these words like failure or foolishness or weakness. God shows what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, what's weak in the world to shame the strong. And we know about the St. Paul's idea about my strength is made perfect in weakness, that weakness is a state of vulnerability, it's a state of self-awareness, but it's also a state in some ways, I suppose, of blessing, because it means that we are, as broken vessels, capable of being built up again, to being repurposed, to being moved forward, to do something which is useful. So that's one sort of a small taster, I think, of some of the theology that I think underpins this constant idea. I don't think it's just a Western idea. I don't think it's just modern society. I think it's been ingrained in us since we came out of the caves. You know, I think this sense of self-monitoring to the point where it becomes self-criticism is something which is probably hardwired into human brains. But there are some interesting questions around that, because if that's the way we see ourselves, then what happens if you step back and ask a different question, which is, how does God see you? How does God see each of us? It wasn't so long ago that we were talking about the words spoken at the baptism of Christ. This is my child, my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. So if God sees you that way, how does God want you to see yourself? Does God want you to celebrate something about the way you are, full of quirks and failures and all of the characteristics that we heard in the summary of all of the characters in the Bible, the characters that have been part of God's unfolding story? There's something also about being centered and grounded, because the result of self-awareness can be, I suppose, pride, it can be self-congratulations, but it can also be a sense of finding stillness and calm and centeredness, and a grounded centeredness which makes people useful, because that's what we're here for. We're here to be useful. And we know that we are less useful when we are stressed, and we are less useful when we are beating ourselves up, and we are less useful when we are critical. And we also know if people trust you, something happens. The way that sentence goes on is very important. If people trust you, they can trust in God's love. And if they can trust in God's love, then they can love one another. It's interesting, isn't it, how powerful some of this work is. So even if you're only moderately successful in gaining just a little bit of confidence, a little bit of certainty, a little bit of clarity about what you have to offer, the knock-on effect of that is very significant indeed. So 4 words, the most common phrase in the Bible, and you know what it is: do not be afraid. Interesting, isn't it, that of all the words that could be repeated over and over again, like wake up or listen or obey the Lord your God, the most commonly repeated phrase in the whole Bible is do not be afraid. So there's something there about the writers of the Bible not only understanding the theology that they were trying to work through in the stories they were writing, but also understanding the people they were dealing with. So what does that mean for the way we see ourselves? What does it mean to see ourselves as God sees us? Maybe even becoming better at accepting ourselves simply as children of God. And I suppose also to accept some of the gifts that we're given. So some of the gifts that we are given is the gifts of insight we acquire from other people. And the thing about self-talk is, of course, that it's the brain's self-deception that says, I can work this out myself. All I need to do is keep processing this idea, keep turning it around, keep repeating the same mantras until I get an outcome. And we all know, I hope and I trust, that one of the great breakthroughs of this is to move forward through conversations with other people. So what I'd love to do is for you to have a broader conversation now. We're going to have groups of 3 or 4, and I'd really like you to think of some of the material. And I want to say something about what we've just been talking about, really, as part of the second section, growing into confidence, where I'm going to just try and share some practical tools which have worked with a wide range of people. I'm not saying that they work perfectly every time. I'm not saying they transform people from being terribly insecure to flawless confidence. What I'm saying is that they help in small ways. And this is the first one really relates quite closely to what we've just been talking about, which is ways of dealing with self-talk. And this is one of the things that, in the sense we've already touched upon, which is to, when you're doing that, when you're examining your own behaviors, just to try, either on your own or with somebody else, to separate facts from feelings. So how you felt about it is important. It needs saying, you need to be honest about those feelings, but it's only a place of discovery for a short period of time, because otherwise the feelings are what you engage with, nothing else. The facts are also important. So let's say you had a conversation with somebody and you thought it went really badly. It's useful to try to separate how you felt about it from what actually happened. How did the other person feel? Was it the worst possible outcome? Other ways of recovering from it? Is it really as bad as you thought? And a great principle in positive psychology is this idea that you review once. Reviewing once means you review thoroughly. It's okay, you may have handled a meeting really badly and people were angry and resentful, and you went home feeling really terrible about it. It's a great discipline to try to review once. Review once says, what actually happened? How can I do something differently next time? What strategy can I use? Not 100 strategies, probably just 1 or 2 things that you'll do differently. What have I learned from this? And what will I put into effect? And then to put it to one side. I know it's easier said than done, but on the other hand, it can be done. And people have tried this and it has worked. What else works? Well, we start by understanding some of the things that we know from research that's been done into clergy well-being. Factors that influence growth. And this is 4 years ago, but so I think it's still got some validity. Understanding how ministers grow and how they thrive. And these are some of the factors. Some of them we know about, like calling, about changing the role, about flexibility and freedom within the role. But look at the last 2, so it's seeking and receiving feedback. Seeking and receiving. Feedback doesn't happen by accident. It happens because there are people around you capable of giving you feedback, and you ask for it. And supportive colleagues is part of it. And I know a lot of clergy complain that they are isolated. And what they often mean is that there are no other clergy around or people that don't really understand what they do. But that's worth testing sometimes, because there are people around and there are support structures and there are people who have done the job before you and done a very similar role somewhere else. And there are people that probably do understand, perhaps a little bit better than you think. And there may be even people with experience in other walks of life who understand imposter syndrome just as well as you do, who understand difficult people and difficult conversations just as well as you do, but in a different context. I'm watching out for the mental traps, because we've heard about the 2 o'clock in the morning voices, but these are the kinds of things that can also get in the way. These absolute statements. It's got to be right. I've got to get everything right. Well, you don't have to get everything right, because nobody does. They may look as if they do, but in fact, what's going on often behind an apparently effortless performance is a great deal of recovering from mistakes or adapting or improvising on the spot. It all depends on me. Well, that's a dangerous one, isn't it? And that's one of the biggest traps that clergy fall into, particularly if you're perhaps the only ordained person in a particular context. It all depends on me. Relate that phrase, if you like, to what we were doing earlier, which is, how does God see you? God may be saying, yes, some of it depends on you. There's an important task, But there's a lovely phrase, isn't there, about asking God to give us strength equal to our tasks, not tasks equal to our strength. In other words, there's so much of the theology that we live and breathe that actually says we will be given tasks that are outside our knowledge and our understanding, and we will be thrown in the deep end, and God will be there when it happens. And these are things that we find in all walks of life. I haven't got time to delegate. I probably hear that a lot more from clergy than I do from many other people. And it's partly because the structure of the way we work as ministers means that if we work as teams, it's almost accidental. So a lot of people are quite happy working on their own, or feel they should be essentially doing everything on their own. And although they'd like to delegate, they just don't have the time. And we've heard that last one there. I mean, it's a really important one because it is a position of isolation and vulnerability. And if that's part of the self-talk that occupies your mind, it's good to think about what you put on the other side of the balance, the other side of the scales. Because as we've already said, there's something going on here, which is actually about the way human beings are fairly hardwired to seek negative information. And we seek danger. Giselle expressed it beautifully. There's something in the primeval brain which is good at watching out for danger signals. We operate a kind of radar. Now, as you know, radar is really good at identifying enemy objects. That's what it's for. And the radar that we exercise does the same thing. It looks for negative views of us. It looks for hostile approaches. It looks for critical voices. It even interrogates messages for tone to say, what's going on here? Well, surely there's a hidden criticism here. And the strange thing is that even in this world of technology, because we use things like email so often, where tone is much harder to manage, it's much, much easier now to misread something into a message. So one of my suggestions to you is that you always err on the side of generosity in terms of interpreting tone, unless somebody's actively being rude to you, assume that they're not. But the internal blocks are like this. So we're really good at looking for negative information. So 4 or 5 people might be saying to you in the course of one day in your parish, or one day, whatever context you're in, you did a great job, that handled that meeting really well, really enjoyed your sermon. And then the 6th person maybe says, you're looking a bit tired today, or why haven't you replied to my email, or you're not doing things that I want you to do, or any of those critical things. Then the point is, of course, that's what the radar is looking for. So we can ignore 85% of positive feedback in order to latch on to 15% that says you're actually not really very good at this. How do we counterbalance that? Well, part of it is something called small step thinking, which is rather than thinking, I've got to fix everything, I've got to change my attitudes, my behaviors, I've got to learn a whole new set of skills, I've got to do everything entirely differently. That's not going to work. Small step thinking says, try one thing, try doing one thing differently, try changing one relationship, one conversation, one approach. So if you find it difficult, certain kinds of meetings difficult, get someone else to start the meeting, get someone else to chair the meeting. If you find certain conversations difficult, start them in a different place. That could mean physically, geographically, have them in a different context. It could mean surprising people by being much more generous and much more open than they expect. Small step thinking is very powerful because it is literally one step at a time and building one task at a time and one activity at a time. The Franciscan writer Richard Raw expresses something which expresses similar language in lots of other contexts. We don't think ourselves into new ways of living, we live ourselves into new ways of thinking. I was taught that phrase in a different way, which was that we act our way into new ways of thinking. And there's something actually about the way the brain learns. And the brain learns by observing your own behaviors and behaviors in other people, We could also learn from imagined behaviors. So if you imagine yourself having a calm and civilized conversation with somebody tomorrow morning, it's almost as if you've experienced that. And if you act in the beginning of that conversation as if it is a calm and civilized and gentle conversation, it is more likely to actually be that. So the way we operate, the behaviors we demonstrate, actually have a really powerful effect on the way we think, the way we think about ourselves. These are a potted digest of some of the things that positive psychology teaches us. Doing one thing differently, we've talked about. 10% change means don't try and do anything like a total refit. Just change 10%. Be 10% more open, 10% more energetic, 10% more focused, 10% more attentive, 10% more creative. 10% is this thing that we can change almost on a daily basis, because it's 6 minutes in every hour. It's that just sense of, I'm going to use this small amount of time and focus during the course of a day, just giving attention to times where I can actually do something which is more useful. Back to that word again. Preparing for the receipt of message means that if you're going to receive feedback, you have to be able to know what to do with it. Feedback isn't an excuse to beat ourselves up. It's an opportunity to learn and to change. So we all know that feedback is sometimes given because of another kind of an agenda, and that's fine. You need to hear the agenda as well as the words. But genuine feedback, if it's based on facts, is an opportunity to review wants. And catching the up cycle is about the natural emotional cycle that many of us experience, particularly in ministry, which is that we follow a kind of sine wave. So when people are praising us or responsive or encouraging or saying yes to our best ideas, we in the up part of the cycle, and the bottom part of the cycle is where people are ignoring us or rejecting us or saying no or refusing to cooperate, or refusing to even get involved in conversations. And it's quite important that you are conscious of where you are in that emotional cycle, and you will go through that cycle many times, sometimes in the course of the day. This is a modern understanding of the volatility of the human mind, and it's wisdom to say, make certain kinds of decisions and commitments in the up stage of a cycle. So when you're feeling better about life and yourself generally, that's the time to start something new or to make an interesting phone call that opens up possibilities. And if you recognize that you're at the bottom end of the cycle, then don't make an important decision and don't make an important phone call. That's the worst time to be negotiating the next stage of your ministry, for example, if you're in that stage. You might think it's just modern stuff, but if you go back to Ignatian spirituality, it's called consolation and desolation. It's all there. It's an understanding of the human mind, which goes back for as long as we've been writing things down. Doing it as if is a principle that Richard Rohr touches upon in his idea of acting your way into a new way of thinking. So doing things as if you are already successful. Communicating with people as if they are already listening. Walking into a situation, walking into a meeting, walking up to the pulpit, if you like, as if you already have people's attention. It actually works. It's a kind of theatre, really. It is a kind of acting, but acting in the really biggest sense of allowing stillness in your body to project a certain kind of confidence, you could say, or attentiveness, or preparedness, or preparation for the next thing. But when we think of people who are confident, one of the things we often notice about them is that they are quite still. They're not flapping. They're not waving their arms around like I am at the moment. They're not. Their attention isn't flitting between one thing and another. They're not speaking quickly. They are giving people's attention properly. They're giving ideas and discussion proper attention. They may even be speaking relatively slowly at times, but because they're thinking about what they're saying. And suddenly they're commanding confidence and they feel more confident. Locus of control is a lovely idea, isn't it? Because locus of control says who's actually in charge here. So it's all those people that say, well, you know, the reason I failed my driving test 167 times was I had the wrong kind of car and the wrong kind of driving instructor and the wrong kind of road and the wrong kind of dogs that were chasing me down the street. And there comes a point where the locus of control rests with us to say, well, maybe you actually do need to think about what it is you have to learn, what it is you have to take control of and take responsibility for. But I love the serenity prayer. That'd be very familiar to you all. And it's great wisdom in that. I use this so often, not this prayer necessarily, but just encouraging people to focus on the things that they have some control over. That spotting the difference between the things you have some control over and the things you don't goes to the heart of what we were saying earlier on about energy. Because if you're wasting energy trying to fix things that are completely outside your control, then that energy is lost. But if there's something you can make 10% better, a person you can make 10% more comfortable, then you can do it. And these are immediate results because they are things within your control. So we talked earlier on about radar, didn't we? And we've shared amongst ourselves this wonderful ability that we have for self-talk to latch on to negative information. We talked about the relationship that has with the way we perhaps trust and understand that God sees us, even if we're unsure about that, in all honesty. Surely a kind of tenet of our faith is that we are loved by God and we are made by God, and we know from that long list of kind of unlikely characters that we read earlier on that God takes the most unlikely people and shapes them to his purposes. That doesn't mean he bangs them out of shape. It doesn't mean he distorts them and doesn't turn them all into heroes and saints. Often they carry on being unlikely people, but they just do more of the things which are useful, in the language we would say, useful to the kingdom or useful to other people. So when you're gathering negative thoughts and when you're switching on your radar, what can you put on the other side of the balance? So I hope I've tried to persuade you. I know I've tried to persuade you that we're really good at gathering those negative pieces of information or what we think are negatives. We're really good at giving those things a lot of attention. So the seesaw gets very easily unbalanced. So we need to actively put something on the other side. Conventional wisdom says, well, you just pray harder, or you pull yourself together, or you just sort of take control of a situation. Well, of course, it's very difficult to do that on your own. The best antidote, the best aid that we have to putting ideas on the other end of the seesaw, the positive end of the seesaw, comes from other people. And I do actually think this is theologically quite rich, because it says that, yes, we are given individual gifts, but we are also given the bigger resource of the community that we commit to. We are given the resource of friends and mentors and guides and coaches and spiritual directors and soul friends and pastors and all of those people who will assist us in so many ways to remember what is on the positive end, to remember not just that we have strengths and qualities. That's a kind of modern Western way of saying I'm a skilled person. I'm not really talking about that. I'm really saying, remembering that we are useful, remembering that there are things that we are called to do, and within our capabilities, no matter how expert we are, our usefulness will be important. So to the idea of a support trio. Support trio is something I would really recommend to all of you, particularly those of you who suffer from imposter syndrome. And that is, you meet regularly with two positive-minded friends. They don't have to be ordained. They may not even need to be Christians, but they're positive-minded in the sense that they will remind you of what you've done well. They'll remind you what you're good at. They'll be open-minded about possibilities for things you can do in the future and the possibilities for change and growth and trying something new and doing something different and opening up new opportunities. They are encouragers and idea builders. And it's powerful because, you know, it is almost Trinitarian, isn't it? There's something about three people being together in these conversations, which allows for one person to be really listening. One person might be advising or asking interesting questions or conversing or engaged, but the other person is doing a different kind of listening. And there's also something deeply powerful about sharing a concern or an idea or something that's worrying you with two other people. Now, it doesn't work if these two people are feeling as negative as you are. I'm going to warn you about that. It doesn't work if they're people that say, yeah, well, that's what people are like. Life is like that. You can't trust anybody in this world. That's not the kind of people you want in your group. You want positive-minded people who see the glass as half full, at least half full. It's a wonderful expression I came across. It's a car hire firm in New Zealand called Juicy, J-U-C-Y. Bad spelling, but great brand, Juicy Car Hire. They have orange cars all over New Zealand, and they have a great brand on the side of their buildings that says the glass is half full and the other half was delicious. And I love that. That's the whole glass in one phrase. So find two other people who will do some of this for you. Mutual encouragement and empowerment and reflection. And what I'd love you to do is to try that out this evening. And we're going to put you in groups of three. One of the threes may be a four. It'll still work. But not groups of two, because two people together naturally forms a kind of a coach or coachee or a mentor and mentee or a spiritual director and a traveler kind of relationship. But three people have a completely different dynamic. So what I'd love you to do is to bring something to this conversation. It could even be a piece of self-talk. It could even be, I'm always saying this to myself. It could be, I'm most worried about. The thing that keeps me awake is. Now, hopefully something which is manageable enough to have a short conversation with. If it's a huge life issue, I'm afraid it will be rather tough to deal with it in 5 minutes. But I'd love you to have the opportunity to spend 5 minutes each just experiencing what it's like to work with two other people. So, and if you're one of the other two people in the trio, then your role is to be a great listener, to encourage, to try to see positives in what's been described and try to draw out strengths and qualities in the person that's presenting to you. So we've got time to do this. We're going to give you 15 minutes. That gives you 5 minutes per person. It'd be great if you can all have a go, but at least you'll all experience it. So David, if you could put them into trios, please, into support trios.
2 trios and 1 quad.
That's
so
it.
If the quad could manage their time accordingly, that would be great.
It means that in the quad, one of you will just have to be an observer. I'm sure you can work it out.
Okay, here goes. Oh, Martin, you're not. I'm going to send you to room 1, Martin, okay?
Good.
So there are 2 groups of 4.
Yeah. There are 2 groups of 4. Okay, that's fine.
And 1 of 3, yeah.
Ah, yes, of course, yeah. It's fine. As long as they're not pairs, it's still very workable.
Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it, when you plan these things, I think, well, 2 hours is a very long time, but
It soon goes, doesn't
It
it?
soon goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I wanted to make sure that we did actually have the 15 minutes to